Young boy in Hannibal. Sam Clemens might be rough and ready. He might skip school and go off to make mischief on the Mississippi. He might pluck his mother and tease his brothers and sister, but underneath he was also sensitive. He was alert to injustice, cruelty, suffering, sin. As a young boy, he was tormented again and again by the thought that he was an evil little boy who deserved punishment. Sometimes, when thunder and lightning seemed to be tearing Hannibal to pieces, Sam awoke and promised to turn over a new leaf. He would vow that he would not skip school or tease Orion or fight with Henry. He would promise God that he would try to help his mother and Pamela more and that he would obey his father at all times. But in the morning, with the sun shining, he would forget his vows and engage in some new prank. Then he would be plunged into guilt again. Sam chafed much at the restrictions of school as a boy on the Mississippi, growing up at a time when America was first beginning to feel its bigness and its coming greatness. He was stirred by what was happening all around him. When he was small, he saw the rush for the new territories. Every day he saw the glamorous life of the steamboat pilots. He watched pioneers passing through Hannibal on their way west. He knew the stories of the famous scouts of the frontier and the famous battles in the west. School often seemed to him hindrance. He longed for the freedom to do what he wanted, and he wanted to do everything at once. Like most boys, he could not wait to make his dreams a reality. His restlessness got him into frequent trouble with the side of his nature that wanted to join the pioneers or be a pilot on the river. He worshipped Tom Blankenship, the son of the town drunkard, who Tom didn't have to fuss with school. He could go barefoot when he pleased. He could swim when he wanted. He went fishing when the mood took him. He went out in a boat on the river without anyone making a fuss. Tom had no mother and his father never cared what he did. Some might feel sorry that Tom lacked the love of a mother and the discipline of a father, but he couldn't help envying Tom his freedom. Sam Clemens remembered and revered that happy-go-lucky boy all his life, and years later he wrote a book all about him. That book was The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn. The Adventure of Huckleberry Finn. And the boy that Sam called Huck was really Sam's boyhood friend Tom Blankenship. But at the same time, Sam envied Tom. He knew with another side of his nature that Tom was headed for trouble. Tom lacked discipline. He had no real knowledge. He could not stick to anything for any length of time. These habits might be accused in a boy, but they would be blamed in a man. Already there were signs that Tom would run into difficulties when he was older, and always before Sam's eyes was the image of his mother standing for all that was good in life. If Tom stood for the carefree, irresponsible side of life, Jane Clemens represented the well-ordered, high-principled standards of another way of living. Sam Clemens' father, it was true, also upheld this position, but the judge did it so joylessly that it wasn't appealing to his young son. For Jenny Clemens, however, Sam could have nothing but respect and admiration. Sam never forgot her pluckiness. He used to say in later life that he thought his hatred of tyranny came from his mother, and he would tell the story of the time that she took on single-handed the biggest bully in town. The man was beating his daughter unmercifully, and the girl fled to the Clemens house for help. Jane Clemens, a little woman, stood bravely in the door, the girl cowering behind her. Mrs. Clemens refused to let the angry father get near his daughter. Then she gave the bully such a talking to that he slunk away ashamed. Later, he went around Hannibal advertising his own humiliation and calling Jenny Clemens she the bravest woman he had ever met. Her son heartily agreed. No, Sam Clemens could never escape the voice inside which said that skipping school was wrong, that disobeying his mother was wrong, that being willful and lazy was wrong. He wasn't only injuring his mother and father, but he was also hurting himself. When he did wrong, he knew it. Consequently, he suffered. He felt guilty for his escapades, but he was always breaking his resolutions and getting into trouble again. One day Sam skipped school, and again it grew later and later. He became more and more afraid to go home. Finally, having worried away all of the afternoon, he saw darkness come on, and he thought he had better stay away. Perhaps he thought if he stayed away a long time, his mother and father would worry about him so much that they would forget that he had played hooky. They would be too relieved that he was safe to punish him. He decided to hide in his father's office. He climbed into the window and went to couch. The room was very dark and he could see nothing, but he knew the office well and he felt his way to the sofa. As he lay down, his eyes gradually made out the familiar furniture in the room. Then suddenly a cold shiver went through him. He had seen something that was not familiar at all, a figure laying on the floor. He shut his eyes, opened them again, but the figure had not gone away. Frightened, he determined to close his eyes and count. Waiting until the moonlight fell on the figure, he counted 20, then opened his eyes. A pale patch of moonlight lay on the far side of the room. He closed his eyes and counted to 50. Then he lost courage and went on to 100. When he opened his eyes, at last a white human hand lay in the moonlight. He shut his eyes, praying, counted, and looked again. And arm was now but in whiteness. He put his hands over his eyes and counted until he thought he had forgotten how. In the moonlight, he saw the face of a man, the eyes staring straight ahead, glassy and unmoving. The man was indeed dead. He had been stabbed in the breast during a quarrel in one of the local taverns. The dead man had been brought into Judge Clemens' office and had been left there until an investigation could be made. In the dim light, Sam had not seen the body when he slipped through the window. The corpse on the floor was not the only dead man to haunt his dreams. One day, a tramp had passed Sam on the street. He wanted to light his pipe, but he had no matches. The tramp asked Sam for a match, and the boy gave him one. Later, the tramp was arrested and put into jail. Apparently, he fell asleep in jail with the lighted pipe in his hand. Perhaps he dropped the match Sam had given him on the straw covered floor. Whatever happened, the straw covering on the floor caught fire, and in a few seconds, the entire cell was a mass of flames. The pitiful man screamed and pleaded for someone to save him, but there was no time. He burned to death before anyone could get to him. Sam held himself responsible. He had given the tramp the match. The match had ignited the straw. The man had burned to death because of that match. Sam was haunted by the face of drunken tramp, pleading for someone to save him. Now, when the thunderstorm shook Hannibal, Sam Clemens lay in his bed thinking that it was he the heavens was angry with. He had been responsible for a man's death. He had come upon another man who had died violently, come upon him because he had been bad and had been trying to escape punishment. Then came a drowning of Lem Hackett. Lem had fallen out of an empty flatboat one Sunday. The preacher at the lesson that evening used the boy as an example of how the evil are punished for their sins. Lem Hackett was known in Hannibal as a bad boy. After the lesson that night, Sam Clemens returned home, brooding on his own evils. There was a fearful storm that night. When the wind blew, the windows rattled, and the rain swept along the roof in pelting sheets, and at the briefest of intervals, the inky blackness of the night vanished. The houses over the way glared out white and blinding for querying instant. Then the solid darkness shut down again, and splitting peal of thunder followed, which seemed to rend everything in the neighborhood to shreds and splinters. Sam remembered in life on the Mississippi. Sam remembered in life on the Mississippi. Sam was sure that this was heaven's way of showing the sinful how it might punish them as it had punished Lem Hackett. Sam was frightened half to death, sure that his own sins were being brought up for consideration. Every time he writes, the lightning glared, I caught my breath and judged I was gone. In my terror and misery, I mainly began to suggest other boys and mention acts of theirs which were wickeder than mine and peculiarly needed punishment, and I tried to pretend to myself that I was simply doing this in a casual way and without intent to divert the heavenly attention to them for the purpose of getting rid of it myself. Sam said it was one of the longest nights he had ever known. He endured agonies of remorse for sins which I knew I had committed and for others for which I was not certain about, yet was sure that they had been set down against me in a book by an angel who was wiser than I and did not trust such important matters to memory. He promised again that he would turn over a new leaf, his last, if only he were spared. All he wanted was a chance to survive so that he could prove that he meant every promise he had made. The next morning, exhausted but thankful, Sam went out timidly wondering who in Hannibal had been taken that night. He said he was surprised to come across a particularly well known sinner on the street, a boy whose prank he really considered far worse than his own. Then he had a dim sense that perhaps the whole thing was a false alarm, that the entire turmoil had been on Lamb's account and nobody else. The world looked so bright and safe that there did not seem to be any real occasion to turn over a new leaf. Moreover, the impressive part of the argument for him was that all the other wicked boys in Hannibal were still alive. The extraordinary thing was that 3 weeks later there was another drowning and another fierce and frightening storm. Only the details of the drowning this time put things in a new light for Sam Clemens, at least on the workings of the universe. The boy who drowned was known as Dutchy. He was German, a good dull, plodding youth who spent his time memorizing verses of the scripture. It was said he could recite 3,000 without missing a word. Nevertheless, he got drowned. He just the same as Len Hackett, who did not know one single line of the Bible. Sam was a part of the events that led up to the Dutch's death. The boys were swimming in a creek which had a sunken pile of green hickory poles. The boys would go down and see who could stay down the longest, hanging on to the poles. Dutchy was such a failure at the game that all the others made fun of him, and at last he was so angry that he begged for one last chance. This time he said he would stay down longer than any of the others. Dutchy went down, but he did not come up. The boys had hidden, wanting to tease him. They thought it would be very funny if he came up and saw no one around to witness his triumph. Minute after minute passed and the German boy did not appear. The boys' laughter turned to fright. Finally, they drew straws to decide who would go down and investigate. Sam lost, and it was his job to go down. Sam recalled years later that he went down and the water was so muddy that the water was so muddy I could not see anything, but I felt around among the hoop poles and presently grasped a limp wrist which gave me no response. And if it had I should not have known it, I let it go with such a frightened suddenness. The boy had been caught among the hoop poles and entangled there, helpless. Sam went to the surface and reported the news, but the boys were too overwhelmed by the tragedy to think of saving Dutchy. They rushed and ran away as fast as they could. That night there was a storm worse than the one that had occurred on the night of Lem Hackett's death. The lesson for young Sam Clemens, as he tells us, was that it convinced me that if Dutchy, with all his perfections, was not a delight, it would be vain for me to turn over a new leaf, for I must infallibly fall hopelessly short of that boy, no matter how hard I might try. Nevertheless, I did turn it over. A highly educated fear compelled me to do that, but succeeding days of cheerfulness and sunshine came bothering around, and within a month I had so drifted backward that again I was as lost and comfortable as ever. There is characteristic humor and irony in that final conclusion of Mark Twain the writer, but the truth is that Sam Clemens the boy suffered a good deal from his feelings of failure. Sam always carried with him the picture of the tramp burning alive in the local jail. He always remembered the corpse on the floor of his father's office. He thought of the two boys that had drowned, the one such a bad boy and the other such a good one. He often dreamed of these scenes and awoke from his terrible nightmares, shivering and shaking. Other times he woke in his sleep, driven by the inner torment of those events. His troubled nights were a cause of deep concern to his mother, but Sam felt that she was so good and he was so bad that he could never explain to her his guilty conscience. But Sam felt that she was so good and he was so bad that he could never explain to her his guilty conscience.